This is a tutorial that addresses using digital darkroom techniques and going through and dealing with contrast issues in the shots that you might be taking. I'm using iPhoto, but if you're using a PC, I know Windows and others have very similar types of software that ships with their laptops and tablets, that type of thing. For all intents and purposes, here I'm using iPhoto, but it has pretty much the same types of tools that are involved here. Over here on the right is a histogram, and I'll do a tutorial about histograms a little bit later. And then we have an exposure, calibration, a contrast, and saturation. If you watch as I pull these back and forth, you can see how we can over or underexpose that. I'm going to set that back to 0 or close to that. In contrast, I can go through and increase the contrast, making it very contrast, or I can decrease the contrast, making it go really bland. And then saturation, meaning in color. I can take all the chroma out and take it in the black and white, or I can pop it way up and make it look terrible, as the case might be. From a black and white standpoint, if I wanted to go through and deal with contrast that way, maybe I'll come back and do that as an editor or as a tutorial a little bit later on making this a black and white shot that has a little bit more interest. I'm going to return everything to zeros here to zero that out. So exposure, contrast, and saturation. Some other tools deal with definition, highlight, shadow, sharpness, and denoising. We'll get to these later on. We won't be dealing with those within this image, nor will we be dealing with definition. The main thing I want to talk about here has to do with highlights and shadow. Now, this is an image taken in Zion Canyon. It's taken from up above Weeping Rock, and it's looking back at the west side of the canyon. It's relatively, it's mid-morning or so with the sun shining on this west side. And you see lots of detail is washed out. Even detail in the sky is washed out because of the highlights. While I'm missing also a lot of detail down here in the shadows. I want to go through and restore this, or at least bring this shadow area a little bit closer to the highlight area when it comes to exposure. Because what we're seeing here is probably a good 2.5, 3, maybe 3.5 stops exposure difference between what's happening down here in these shadows and what's happening up here in the highlights. Now, one of the main tools that I have to use this to do with this is the highlights tool here. If I take that and I start moving that to the right, if you watch the sky start to turn a little deeper blue, as well as pull a little bit more detail off of the side of the canyon there. I'm going to do this quickly so you can see it a little bit better. Go back and forth. Okay, with it on, with it on. So it's just going through and taking a look at the top part of the histogram and pulling out those types of details, which is really what I really want to be seeing here without to improve the overall detail of the image. Now, I'm going to boost the contrast of this a little bit because as I do so, this is going to give me some room now to go through and do the same thing I did up here with the highlights down here with the shadows while still maintaining some level of contrast. So I'm going to go through and boost the shadow up now, and you see the color starting to become saturated there while I still have a little bit of contrast happening. If I take the contrast out, you'll see how bland that goes. So I'm just going to put that up right in the back into there, and I'm going to boost these shadows right up to where it becomes a little bit more believable to the human eye, right about, for me and my taste, right about in there. So what I've done here is I've improved the overall exposure of the image. And if I were working in a dark room with an enlarger, we would call this dodging, going through and exposing for highlights and shadows and creating more of a zonal quality to that. That's what Ansel Adams did. Here, I'm just using digital darkroom techniques to go through and pull it off. And arguably, you can see this is a much more pleasing photograph than what we started with. Watch what happens when I go through and undo. This is our finished work, and this is what whoops, I'll go one more, undo. And that's what we started with. There we go. And that's the tutorial on contrast.